We are now moving to our first panel and discussion of the day, and it's going to be moderated by Paula Gilbert, who is the editor for Connecting Africa. So Paula, please join us on stage. And thank you. I would also like to welcome her panelist, Tom Saffel from YouTube Infrastructure, Funke Opeke from Main One, Ambassador Okekehinde Afolabi from ECOWAS, Oladejo Olawumi from the National Information Technology Development Agency in Nigeria.
Hello and welcome everyone to this first panel discussion here on the last day of Africa Tech Festival. As Tekla said, I'm Paula Gilbert, the editor of Connecting Africa, and I'm very happy to be the moderator today. And we're talking about the topic, big tech and telcos collaborating on digital infrastructure investment. So we know that the digital infrastructure funding gap in Africa is expected to reach $100 billion by 2030, as we have millions of new subscribers coming online at the same time. So there's definitely a significant investment required to make sure we get the connectivity that we need in Africa and make telecom services more affordable. So today we're just unpacking, how disruptive solutions, public-private partnerships, and co-investment can help drive digitalization in Africa and help with last-mile delivery. So I'm very happy to be here on the panel with all of you. You've heard all of their names. I'm just going to give them 1 minute to kind of give a little overview of kind of what work they're doing in the ecosystem so far. So Funke, I'm going to start with you because this lady's first.
All right. Thank you, Paula. Good morning, everyone. My name is Funke Opeke. I'm Managing Director of Equinix West Africa. In 2008, I founded a company that built the first submarine cable system on the west coast of Africa, connecting Nigeria on through Portugal, with landings in several countries, and have been in the digital infrastructure services business since then. In 2022, Main One was acquired by Equinix, and today I'm managing Equinix West Africa. Thank you.
Thanks. Ambassador, we'll come to you next.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Ambassador Afolabi Oke. I'm representing African Union 6th region, and but my previous life, still is. I've been running an IT company for about 20 years, working again with the telcos, with the financial sector, with central bank in Nigeria, and obviously with some central banks in Africa as well. And I'm happy to be here because we'll be sharing exactly what is the vision of Africa, where exactly do we want to be. And I will be sharing some insights in terms of the Agenda 2063, the Africa we all want to see in our future. So thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Oladejo?
Thank you, Paula. I'm Oladejo Olawumi. I work with the National Information Technology Development Agency of Nigeria, which is the government agency basically saddled with the responsibility of regulating the IT space in Nigeria. So what we do in NIDA is, apart from the regulation, we do some development work also, and some of our work has also dovetailed into working with the big tech, as we're going to be speaking about this morning. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I bring you greetings from NIDA. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Tom?
Thank you for having me. I'm Tom Saffel. I lead product management for the infrastructure team at YouTube. That's the team that makes the videos play. My team's been investing for more than a decade in making sure that when we play those videos, we do so as efficiently as possible. We concentrate on things like making sure we're playing the right quality, so we're not using more data than necessary, and deploying caches around the world to make sure that the traffic is traveling as short a distance as possible to get to the user, and investing in network assets like subsea cables. So thank you for having me here.
All right, great. Funke, I'm going to start with you. Let's kind of set the scene of where we are and what kind of state we're in with digital infrastructure in Africa. What is the funding gap that we're facing, and what connectivity goals are we trying to reach, I guess, is the big question.
Thank you, Paula. Having done this for about 20 years, over 20 years, I've been working in this space. Now, I would say considerable progress has been made, but there's a lot more work to be done. And when I think of the infrastructure gaps we have, or the access gap, actually, because when you take it to the last mile and you take it to citizens and communities and people, it's really an access and enablement issue. It's the first thing I see is not necessarily the funding gap, but our inability to orchestrate all the efforts and investments that's currently going in to have the most impact. So I think while governments in Africa have put in broadband plans and different initiatives, and you have a lot of players coming into our markets, ourselves included, building infrastructure and delivering services, the coordination, the frameworks for infrastructure sharing, the incentives for driving that to the last mile and having impact, the orchestration of multimodal technologies to work together, to complement each other, to really drive services to that last mile have not been great. And so in an environment where capital is constrained or limited, it really further compounds that gap, and we're not seeing the gap close as fast as it would need to be. So yes, there is a funding gap, but I think there's also a strategic execution gap and orchestration gap in terms of how we're deploying capital and infrastructure to meet the needs of our people.
Yeah, very good point. Ambassador, I'm interested, through your work with the AU, what have you kind of seen in terms of the growth in connectivity across Africa, but also this funding gap or infrastructure gap?
Thank you very much. I think from our perspective, we have seen some steady growth, to be honest. And we have a lot more people that, currently have access to internet and the services within the continent. But the reality as well, we know the challenges. There has been regional collaboration as well. If we look at the African Continental Free Trade has also deeply encouraged interconnectivity and working together within the different African countries. We've also had, I think, because of COVID also woke a lot of us up in terms of there's been a lot of tech-led solution where innovation around e-health, e-education, and we've seen a lot of expansion in that space as well. But again, we have our steady challenges, which is, like Funke rightly said, funding is a major issue. The rural last mile connectivity is also something that we really have to really work hard to have a lot more people benefit from this. Then also there's a dependence on international investment, whereby the local companies or the local countries are not really benefiting, because this is meant to create jobs for the local countries as well, and also help with employment. So there's some challenges that we really need to resolve. But again, the role of the African Union is basically to help around policy and regulatory support, continue to encourage, PPP model, public-private partnership model, and the long-term vision of African Union. There's an Agenda 2063, which I call the IPP, the Integrated, Prosperous and peaceful Africa we all want to see by 2063. And to achieve this agenda, we need to continue to collaborate and see how we can effectively work together to truly create the Africa we want to see. We cannot achieve that without digital unity as a continent. And I believe that with time we'll be able to achieve this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ambassador. Oladejo, from a Nigeria-specific perspective, what are the country's connectivity targets, and what areas are you looking to invest in to promote strategic local infrastructure development?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we had the broadband plan, which in one, my sister here, she was actually key to the process, the broadband plan, which from 2020 to 2025, which specifically states that we want to have a 90% penetration by the year 2025, and to have the speed of 25 meg for the urban areas and 10 for the rural areas, and 70% penetration. So that was the target from in the broadband plan, and we're actually working towards it. However, the plan is subject to review by next year, which is 2025. The main challenges, like the two earlier speakers have mentioned, have been issues of funding. However, the main big techs have been investing in infrastructure, but what we've seen is that the uptake from the uptake has been low, because we want a situation whereby their investment is complemented with other things, such as inclusion by our own people. That is things like data, making use of the data, because that is now what will now drive the use of what they are actually putting on ground. However, what to do this, we need to have some particular laws in place. And that is why over the recent months, we have been saying that we need to have a sort of way of ensuring that we generate that drive, we generate that the need to use those infrastructures. And how do we do that? But using data. Now, we have been pushing for data sovereignty in the country, which is part of that, to ensure that these infrastructures are there, but the local people there, the indigenous people, the citizens too, they own it and they want to make use of it. However, to do that, we need to have the data in place in Nigeria, and to complement what the infrastructure that they're putting on ground. So the infrastructure is there. However, we need to drive more for the uptake for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll get a bit more into some of the other challenges in a minute. But Tom, I'm interested, can you tell us more about the work that YouTube and Google has been doing, when it comes to infrastructure investments, and also what you were talking about, investing in efficiency in the back end and reducing, data load on the networks?
Sure, happy to. First of all, I think that the challenge we see in Africa is one of connectivity and affordability. And when we think about affordability, that's not just the data the device has too. And there are many users we know in Africa who are passed by a 4G signal, but don't have a device that can support it. And that's part of where our, the efficiency work that we do comes in. So I mentioned briefly, but we always make sure that when we're playing a video, we're using as little data as we possibly can. And this is really important because it allows users limited data budget to allow them to spend more time and engage more, learn more. We also do things like invest in the technology of video codec, which is in a sort of a compression algorithm, and we're constantly investing in making sure that we're using the most efficient ones, and our ecosystem partners are using those most efficient ones too. And then you mentioned caches, but for those who are not familiar with this program, Google builds and ships caches to ISPs around the world. We have tens of thousands deployed around the world, and this is a machine that is capable of serving a very significant portion of YouTube traffic that can sit typically in the metro. So when users are watching a YouTube video, rather than that having to travel, cross a subsea cable or travel cross-continent, it's able to be served within tens or hundreds of miles of where they are. Those are really big investments. The other thing I wanted to mention is that YouTube really only works well when we have local content creation. This is a really important part. And I have a stat to share with you, which is that over the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out over 70 billion, 70 billion US dollars to creators and artists as their share of revenue that we take. And so what that means is that YouTube works best when we're helping to grow that digital economy, and in doing so, we're funneling that money back into the local economy.
That's great to hear. Funke, I want to get a bit more into the challenges. I know all of you've mentioned it maybe on a surface level, but what are the major challenges to closing this connectivity gap that you see in your market, I guess?
Well, one of the things I mentioned in terms of the gap is really the question of infrastructure sharing and how that works in most of our countries. And if I take the case of Nigeria, in the higher net worth urban areas, you're starting to have a multiplicity, quite a multiplicity of fiber network overbuilds, very little infrastructure sharing. And you look at the most advanced economies and you have unbundling and a lot of shared infrastructure and proper planning in terms of how that infrastructure is deployed. And we're not really getting around to that. And so the urban areas are being overbuilt. The quality, because you're doing all this, what I would call very thin builds, leaves a lot to be desired. And the rural or semi-urban areas are totally underserved. So there is not very good orchestration, again, I would say, of how technology is deployed. And we're seeing that across the continent. So when you look, we also have not had a good unbundling strategy. And most of the infrastructure that we have has been deployed by private players to serve their own customers only. If you look at the advanced economies, typically infrastructure was developed and then unbundling regimes were put in for that infrastructure to be shared as other providers came in to add more value or implement new business models in terms of how you could access those services. And I think environment, both in terms of the business models and the regulatory environment, have simply not evolved to address the current realities and the challenges, and how do we leverage what we have and the investment that's going in better to reach, be it 70 or 90% of the adult population and not have a concentration just in some of the urban areas. And I think that is really the biggest challenge, which is leaving so many people behind.
Yeah, very, very good point. Tom, from the perspective of an OTT player, what are the major challenges that you face when you're trying to expand across Africa? What obstacles are kind of hindering OTT service adoption as well?
Yeah, I mentioned it before, but I think like affordability and connectivity are the two big ones. We met this week with Fiber Time. I don't know if you're familiar, who are running fiber into townships. And I have to say, I was really impressed with the model they'd come up with and their technology. And I would say that, in fact, the technology they're bringing to bear there far outstrips any of the innovation that I see in California, where I currently live. So I was really happy to see that. I think the other challenge, as I mentioned, is getting local creators creating. Like YouTube is nothing without those creators, right? That is where the content comes from, and making sure that those local creators can build for that local audience and also have the opportunity to export that content globally. And so we're investing a lot in creation tools, both in like the YouTube app itself and in the YouTube Create app. And then maybe the last kind of thing I would touch on is, YouTube started actually on as a desktop web application and then quickly moved to a mobile. But increasingly, we're seeing a lot of growth in the living room on televisions. And so making sure that users don't just have that connectivity when they're out and about, but also they have good fiber into the home so they can watch on that bigger screen in those communal situations.
Okay, interesting, thanks. Ambassador, what challenges are you seeing that African governments are facing, when it comes to their national connectivity targets, and how is the AU sort of helping to tackle this?
I think the biggest issue really is the high infrastructure cost, which a lot of countries truly cannot afford, particularly when you look at the rural areas, the last mile. And when you look at the high cost, obviously it's practically impossible for a lot of the local countries, some countries, to afford the high cost of digital infrastructure. So funding is a major issue. And also the funding constraints also does not allow a lot of the rural areas to benefit, from this rollout. But African Union, basically what we're trying to do is to encourage the public-private partnership, and we appreciate the investment from big techs, Google, and all that. But I think what is also important is in that investment, how does that investment truly benefit, the local people, particularly I said, in terms of job creation and all that. So we encourage public-private partnership. Another thing that we're trying to do is also to harmonize regulatory frameworks, because for investors, there are regulations that may bar them from truly investing. So how do we ensure that the investors are comfortable? How do we ensure that the countries are also comfortable and both parties can leverage each other to benefit from whatever funding that is being provided? Like I said, the Agenda 2063 is a vision that we have as Africa, to ensure that Africa is truly, truly integrated. To achieve that, we'll continue to work towards our global agenda, which is the Agenda 2063, to make sure that we're able to fulfill that. But one thing that is also very important that we are trying to encourage is capacity building, because a lot of this rollout requires, skills, and there's huge skills gap in the continent. So the big techs, I think they need to do a lot more to try and see how they can continue to help to build capacities and truly educate the people within this region, because without that local expertise, there isn't much that they can do. It's still going to be extremely expensive. So how do we ensure that we cover the capacity gap? And also, lastly, is the affordability. The moment, if you look at the last mile, right, and the cost of getting to the last mile, I'm sure Funke has got a lot of experience in that space. Now, when you look at the internet services provided for this last mile, can they truly afford it, right, by the time you make that investment? So adoption becomes a major issue. And we're talking about, for us to really benefit from this, we're talking about financial inclusion, right? Everybody today, a lot of people have phones. How can they, offer services, or how can they appreciate the services from this, last mile when it becomes so expensive and they cannot really afford it? So it's a balancing act, but we will continue to create environments where everyone, both the investors and the consumers, can truly benefit from. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ambassador, with all due respect, I'm sitting here and hearing of a vision for 2063, and I certainly don't expect to still remain on this planet that long. But, the sense of urgency, I think it reflects the sense of urgency in our governments in terms of the need for digital access for our populations. If we're thinking of 2063, to enable our citizens, the need is yesterday. If we're going to close the gap in standard of living, education, healthcare, for the youth population, the huge youth population that we have. And I really think that's part of the challenges that I see, is that sense of urgency in government trying to orchestrate frameworks, business models, provide the incentives that enable the continued deployment and growth of infrastructure to every citizen. Digital access, a few years ago, there was a lot of hype about being a civil right. It is indeed, in today's world, a right, a key enabler, a utility for every citizen to be digitally connected. And if we're not going to have it until 2063, or we're waiting for AFECTA to make it happen, then for the 70% of the African population that's under 30, that is really not a good situation. So I think part of it really is, what are our governments doing to prioritize and enable acceleration of digital infrastructure investment to reach every last citizen? And it's not about capital. I really, when we have African problems, we typically throw capital out as, there's not enough capital. Why can't we think of innovative ways? Why can't we think of, given our capital situation, how do we stretch our dollar to go the extra mile? Why do we have mobile coverage over at least 70% of the geographic area of the continent today? And the mobile private companies have been able to do that. Are there other ways we look at complementary infrastructure? What strategies worked to make that happen, and can we apply them in these new areas to make things happen? And so I think we need to challenge ourselves a little bit more. Our government needs to really think of enabling and the sense of urgency in deploying this infrastructure so more of our citizens can gain quality access that is affordable to meet their needs.
I totally agree with you. Thank you for that. But if you truly look at where we're coming from, as Africans, I think that we have made some considerable stride, right?
Agree.
But the reality is that we have in Africa at least 54 presidents, right, that have to come together and agree. Now, the African Free Trade Zone, it took a lot for that to even be signed off, but that has been signed off, right? But the reality also is that in terms of adoption, think about it. We claim to have, or to push for, integrated, Africa. But one of the biggest barriers we currently have is even visas amongst ourselves. So there's several issues that each government, we need to remove the cap of independence. It's my country, it's just for me. We need to truly have that sense of togetherness and being able to agree that this is our priority for now, and we have to put our money where our mouth is. For example, if you look at the initiative of Afreximbank, the PPPs, the Pan-African Payment Settlement System that has just been created, which again helps. If I want to transact within the continent, I can make payments freely between one country to the other. So there's a lot of initiatives, but you must appreciate that we have different governments. They all have to come together and consistently agree on the way forward, which, politically there's several issues, but again, like you said, the commitment from each government is what is critical, because without that, we are not going to make this our priority. Our job is to continue to encourage those presidents, our government, to truly help to adopt and make this a priority for all. And we'll continue to do that. Thank you.
All right, well, good points on both sides, and we'll keep this nice debate going, don't worry. Oladejo, maybe if we're thinking about this urgency, what Funke is talking about, when it comes to regulation, what are the policies that are the most important so that we see rapid digitalization?
Okay, so when it comes to issue of regulation, yes, we have policies in place. However, some of the issues, the challenges have been the policy implementation. And what we have been trying to do now is that we've been trying to ensure that the implementation frameworks for the policies are co-created with the ecosystem. That's with the private investors in this ecosystem. Because without co-creating with them, and if we try to just put out the laws like that, it would be as if we are trying to just force something down on them. So now we have embarked on a form of I would say a PPP, because we could create with them so that any decision we take together, it will be together, and that compliance as against the normal way of enforcing the regulation will be ensured. because now we are trying to push for compliance of these regulations. So what we've done so far to mitigate that is that, first of all, to address the issue of having connectivity and the last mile connectivity, we have been trying to ensure that state government, like in Nigeria, we have state governments, and one of the major challenges is the right of way. So part of the regulation now is trying to ensure that these right of ways, if possible, waived for those practitioners. Another way is to ensure that existing infrastructure could be shared, and that is one of the things that the Universal Service Provision Fund is trying to do, to ensure that there is that sharing of infrastructure where possible, because when you have the rural areas, for example, where some of the main players don't want to go to, and which is affecting part of the plan I mentioned earlier, the broadband plan initiatives, we have a way that, okay, they can actually share and, and have that arrangement amongst them. And then when it comes to the amount of the layout we have fiber optics in Nigeria, yes, they are there, but it's still not enough. And then that is another thing, another way where the USPF fund is trying to actually mitigate. So the regulations are there, the policies are there, and we are bringing out implementation frameworks to ensure that these are actually, the policies are actually implemented, because without that, we don't have policy implementation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's talk a bit more about partnerships. So we know that telecoms operators and infrastructure providers seem to be under pressure, that they need to spend more, they need to expand more, and so they're looking towards partnerships with global tech and OTT players, and also with governments. So Funke, from your side, are connectivity providers kind of feeling that pressure, and what kind of partnerships are you looking for?
Okay, yes, indeed. There is, but it is good pressure, right, to leverage our assets. And I'll talk about our example. And you talked about working across countries. I mean, we're a private company founded, as a greenfield startup. Today, we're delivering services in 11 countries in West Africa. And that's all through our initiative to partner with other countries. So into Cameroon with Camtel, into Burkina Faso and Mali and some of the landlocked countries where we have not built infrastructure, but we've partnered with other operators. We partner with Orange to extend our cable to Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. We partner with Move to take services into some of those landlocked countries. So you really have to work together if you're going to get maximum value out of the assets and get those eyeballs onto the infrastructure that you've built. In addition, we're landing the to Africa. We have the submarine cable we built. We've co-built with Camtel, an extension from Nigeria to Cameroon, and we're landing the to Africa cable, the second landing in Nigeria and Kwayu and the Niger Delta, in an area where it hasn't, there was no direct access before. So I guess we see that partnerships do work. We wish there were more enablement and incentives and facilitation of those partnerships. And it's you have to build them. We recognize you have to build them one at a time. Are there ways governments could actually help accelerate those they're peer-to-peer partnerships, and they're commercially viable at both sides. So that's what you have to look at. You have to look at outcome-based in terms of partnerships, what you're trying to achieve. I think they need to be sustainable. They need to be private sector, where the motivations are aligned to deliver services to the people. And then you need competent parties on both sides. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to do that, rather than have closed. Some of the markets are still closed. Some of the regulation is still infrastructure-based sharing, where parties believe if they have infrastructure and use it just for their own services, then they have a market advantage, and so they don't open up infrastructure. Some of the internet exchanges are not, telcos or mobile players are not pairing traffic locally because they believe they have a larger network and do not want to enable other players to be able to gain access to terminate services easily on their network. So they're forced to go to Europe to pair and come back to Africa, which further drives up costs. So there are lots of things we can do to facilitate more private partnerships and cooperation within the continent to improve service delivery to the citizens.
Okay, great. Tom, maybe from your perspective, what kind of partnerships does YouTube have with, local telcos and connectivity providers, and what are the most popular, types of partnerships in the region?
Yeah, we partner with telcos on data affordability. So, for example, we did a recent partnership with MTN Nigeria, where we helped them offer time-based bundles at lower prices, so to ensure you could watch for a certain amount of time. And in that case, we built some infrastructure to ensure that the data rates that we were using made sure that the data allowance that they were giving allowed for that period of time to be watched. So that would be one. I'd say another one on the kind of commercial side is, we have YouTube Premium as a product, and we allow our operators to resell that and take a revenue share. And that's obviously not directly an infrastructure investment, but it's an investment that brings money into the economy and helps telcos drive up their revenue. And then another one I'd mention is the subsea cables. The Equiano cable has an open access model so that anybody can come and take a line on it. We're also in the early planning stages for the Omojo cable too that would have a similar model. And then the final thing I'd mention is the caches. Funke mentioned, where do you peer and how do you peer? And these caches, again, are a big investment that we make to make sure that telcos don't have to carry that traffic any further than strictly necessary. So those are probably the main four ways we're partnering and to help.
Okay, great, thanks. Ambassador, I saw you smiling while Funke was speaking, but tell us more about public-private partnerships and co-investment, what you've seen, what's working, what's not working across African countries.
I think from what is working, from what Funke already said, is the public-private partnership is working. Without the subsea cable, I don't think we would have, the opportunities we currently have. I don't think we would have achieved what we've achieved so far. So I think the public-private partnership is working. There's also the cross-border collaboration, which I think, again, the African Continental Trade Agreement area, which has been signed by most presidents within the continent, has also helped. So, again, trading between countries has become a lot better than what it was before. And also there has been government incentives in terms of tax breaks for some of the investors. I believe, if we continue in that space, I believe we'll see a lot more investment, and also the ease of doing business by most governments. I think once we can improve on that, I believe we'll see a lot more investment coming through. Challenges that we see are regulatory inconsistencies, right? Because, again, we need to find a way as a continent, which is also part of the discussion, ongoing discussion, to have a harmonized regulatory framework, which I believe is also going to help in terms of making it easier for investors to come in. But one of the challenges we also see is the perceived high risk. Security is a major issue in some areas in Africa, for example. So that also, again, prevents a lot of investment in some areas. Okay. Then, like I mentioned earlier, there's local capacity, which we also have to see how we can improve on that in terms of capacity, the technical capacity within each areas. But lastly, for me, is also the complex procurement processes within some countries. We've identified that. So one of the things we're pushing is how do we ensure the ease of doing business? We try and improve on that so that, some of the benefits, of this investment, can really come through. Well, with that, I believe that, yes, there are pros and cons. We've come this far. We just continue to do our best to push and make sure that we have more investment from the big techs. Thank you.
Oladejo, what kind of public-private partnerships are working well in Nigeria, and what specific frameworks are you working on to make that, easier and more successful?
Okay, thank you. So still from the regulatory point of view, what we've been trying to do is bring up some frameworks. For example, we have the interoperability framework to ensure that all the partners that have been mentioned here, there's that seamless uh, interoperation between all of them so that they can all work together. So they have the interoperability framework. We also work on the DPI framework, which is the DPI is the Digital Public Infrastructure Framework, which tries to bring out the government services to the citizens. And how do we do that? Because the DPI has three main components, which is the payments part of it, the identity part of it, then the data exchange. So what my sister Funke mentioned earlier is about the data exchange, and that is what is key to what we're talking about here. Because without the data exchange part of it, the digital public infrastructure will not be delivered to the citizens. So we are coming up with a framework to actually address that and to ensure that these infrastructures that are on ground, they actually have a way of being used by the citizens to get the services delivered to them. So those are some of the frameworks, implementation frameworks we are working on from the regulatory aspect of it to ensure that, yes, we have the big plan there, the big broadband plan there, but we need to have those frameworks to ensure that this plan actually works and delivers on the mandate by the year we actually mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think let's maybe get a bit more into more on investment specifically. So I think in years gone by, there was a lot of debate over whether Africa was seeing meaningful investment coming from OTT players. But we've seen quite a big change over the last couple of years. Investments not only from local operators, but also major infrastructure investments when we're talking about data centers, fiber, hyperscalers coming in, and then obviously the big companies like Facebook and Google investing in subsea cables. So Funke, from your point of view, who are the biggest investors at the moment, and are we seeing a better balance in the market when it comes to investment sources?
No, thank you. Certainly, I don't know that they're biggest. I would say if you look across the continent, traditionally the MNOs, the mobile operators, have been some of the larger investors over the last few decades, and I think that remains the situation in aggregation across the continent. But as more Africans have gotten onto the internet, I would say the cloud service providers, or the OTTs, you want to call them, have also become investors. And I think, as Tom said, we're seeing direct investment in submarine cables and caches, and indirect investment through revenues that come into the economy from African content and players who are monetizing those services. So I think it's a mix. It's a healthy mix. How we funnel, incentivize more of the kind of investment we want, I think, is the issue. Obviously, post-COVID, a lot of the economies have been challenged from a growth standpoint, and so that has had an impact in terms of affordability and the rate of capital deployment on the continent. But we're also seeing new entrants. I think Main One and Equinix are a testament to that. Digital Realty in the data center space, we're also seeing international investment come to the continent for the first time. And so that's continuing to happen as well. I think at the end of the day, it's that opportunity to drive value, the innovation and the new digital ecosystems that are growing on the continent to deliver services. There has to be the demand, and we're seeing increasing demand from African citizens who are getting connected. We see the opportunity to connect a lot more when we see our youth bulge and the population that we have. And I think that's going to continue driving investment across the spectrum. I don't think you're going to see one to the exclusion of the other. I think it's a value chain where people derive revenue from infrastructure or services or content, and I think all those players will continue to invest.
Yeah, very, very nice. Oladejo, if we look at the notion of, meaningful and equitable investment, how do you facilitate as a regulator a better balance, between maybe international and local companies?
Okay, thank you. So, like as we mentioned earlier, we in Nigeria, yes, we have presence of the hyperscalers, but the presence is not actually on ground because we have the data centers in Nigeria and quite a lot of them because of what the opportunities the broadband plan has provided. However, these infrastructures are not being made use of by the hyperscalers directly because we don't have their presence there on ground because the data being used now, because data is actually the currency of the digital economy. So the data, the vast data there is not localized there in our country. Is actually uh, being taken and not, there in our country, and it's as if that the main investment, which is actually the data, we need that data to be housed in Nigeria to provide the employment in Nigeria so that we can make use of our own data and ourselves, providing for our own data sovereignty, data security, and privacy. So we want to have that, it's not control per se, but that's that leeway to be able to say, okay, this data is being used is being produced in Nigeria and used in Nigeria. So what we've been trying to do from the regulatory point of view is we're trying to bring the hyperscalers together, bring them together with the data center operators and see, let's talk. Do we have the infrastructure to house this data? If we do, then why not have this data here in Nigeria rather than having it elsewhere, like it's been done in other places now? You understand? So that's what we're trying to do now from the regulatory point of view. We're trying to bring the two of them together to talk and say, we agree now, we have this infrastructure, so let's have this data in our country. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize. I missed one category that we're really seeing big investment in, and that has only emerged in recent years, which is the low Earth orbit satellites. And I have to say, Starlink is probably one of the biggest investors we're seeing deploying in the continent, across the continent today, going into a multiplicity of countries and kind of wading through the regulation. It could be easier. AWS Kuiper is also getting ready to launch, and there are quite a bunch of those kind of companies. We're also starting to see interest in early trials of direct satellite to mobile. So I think the satellite space should not be underestimated.
Yeah, for sure. No one can not talk about Starlink at the moment, so for sure. Ambassador, what's your take on that? I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about Starlink or just talking about, collaborative investment in general. What do you see that's working or not working, or where do we need sort of changes to come?
I think what we see is in terms of because of the gap, the capital gap, we've seen a lot of benefits in the shared risk and resources between countries. There's some projects, of course, because of the cost. Some countries have been able to share resources and risks, as it were. And also, one of the things that we see working is access to global expertise, which has also brought a lot of innovation. And for us, what with the successful partnership, the public-private partnership, is something that we see that is working. Like I said, and we'll continue to see how we can improve on that. And payment is very essential. As I mentioned earlier, I think the PAPS that's just recently been launched is also going to enhance a lot of the trade between the countries. But another new thing that we've seen working with regulators is the creation of sandboxes. We all know that innovation and technology moves faster than regulation. And it's being a major issue, particularly in our country where once a regulator does not understand an area, they just ban and ban and ban, and then this really hinders investment and innovation. So one of the things we've been pushing is to have regulatory sandboxes. About 7 countries that currently have it. We work with Ghana, Central Bank of Nigeria. We're also pushing that with NCC, SEC, with the key regulators, where they have regulatory sandboxes where people can innovate and within a test, environment. And obviously, once they see exactly, if you see what happened currently in Nigeria, where Binance was banned and all the noise around that, But if they had this regulatory sandbox and all of this innovation were tested before they rolled out, it would have really helped. So that's one of the discussions we're currently having to say, look, it's not just banning, whether you like it or not, this has come to stay. But how do we ensure that, we understand exactly the innovation and we're able to adopt? So there's sharing within the central banks, within the regulators, in terms of once they have the regulatory sandbox in place. So that is something that we're also working on. There are obviously several areas of improvement. The regulatory alignment is something that I mentioned that is critical, and also consistent knowledge transfer from. I hear my brother talk about the YouTube, the all the investments you're making. How do we continue to build local capacity? I think it's also very, very, very important. So I believe that, like I said, there are pros and cons, but continuous improvement is all that we desire for us to achieve our desired results. The 2063 vision. But we'll work at it. Thank you very much.
Hopefully before 2063. But Tom, yeah, just from your side, on the OTT side, what are the benefits, that you see from partnering, and what kind of investments are working the best, you would say?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say, we really only benefit when users benefit. And so that really starts with making sure viewers have access to the world's information and that creators have a platform that allows them to grow their media businesses. And we actually see, when we look at African creators, we see that 35% of them actually see a majority of the viewership coming from outside of Africa. So we're also building the ability for them to export that business. The other type of investment that we make that we actually see working well is investment in the way we actually design and build our product to make sure it works for the full global audience. And so I mentioned a little bit before about efficiency. We also make sure that we have very low data rate versions of every video that we make so that no matter your connection, it can get through. We invest in MWeb, which is mobile web technology, in addition to our mobile apps. So in those situations where a user can't install an app, they can still get access to YouTube. We invest in making sure that the YouTube app itself is very dynamic in terms of which features it turns on and off, depending on the resources. So if a user has a $100 or $50 phone, Android phone, that maybe isn't as performant, it can still run YouTube really well by selectively turning those things on and off. So those investments in the way we design our product, I think, really help make sure that there's a global access to the product.
Okay, thanks. Ambassador, I'm coming back to you. We've recently seen, in Europe, in the US, in India, places like that, this fair share debate going on between OTT providers and network providers. And I think it's kind of been growing a little bit in Africa as well. So I'm interested in your take on the debate and whether you think there should be more specific regulation in this regard, and should it be Pan-African regulation, or should you kind of leave countries to make their own decisions?
I strongly believe the demand on network infrastructure, obviously, of the OTT is something that is debatable, but both parties really need to work together. Because, if you look at Nigeria now, the Afrobeat is taking on streams. There's several videos coming up, and everybody's building content, daily. But obviously, this has to be accessible to people. So in terms of the demand on the existing infrastructure, both parties really need to work together to see, again, create policies and also ensure that both parties we can benefit, and the cost to, like I said, the last mile, the cost to citizens should not be that expensive. Because if the cost is expensive, then sharing of that content becomes really very difficult because adoption becomes a problem. So both parties really need to come together to see to reduce the cost so that at least every citizen it's affordable for every citizen.
Yeah. Oladejo, in the past, African governments, including South Africa, have kind of taken a wait and see approach to OTT governance, kind of letting the market evolve organically. For Nigeria, it seems that the focus is more on flexible regulation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to that form of regulation, the model we have adopted is not really wait and see, but to allow the ecosystem to grow and to flourish rather than coming with the stick approach and stop that growth and ban things like someone mentioned earlier. So what we do is that we allow to flourish. We allow for that experimental stage for them to flourish and to start the growth. Then we come in at the stage where we need to let them know that, okay, there needs to be some form of regulation, there needs to be some form of compliance, there needs to be some form of adherence to some laws, such as consumer protection, maybe some data privacy laws, some particular laws that will govern their operations. So that is the model we actually adopt, and at the end, we strive towards more of compliance than enforcement. So it's not really just wait and see, it's wait, I will call it wait and flourish, wait and grow. Let them grow, let the market, let them actually have that flexibility to bolster by themselves. Then we come in and try to align them with the necessary existing laws in the land. So that's what we do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Funke, what's your view on regulation when it comes to investment? Should African countries be following what's happening in other regions, or should we be coming up with our own playbook?
I think we need to come up with our own frameworks. I think we need to, there's enough learnings from best practices around the world to develop our own strategies, what outcomes we want for our citizens, what are possible pathways to achieve those outcomes, and then create and continue to iterate on the right sets of incentives and frameworks to achieve those objectives. And I don't think we've done that particularly well. I think some countries, Rwanda is an example where you see a lot more coordination and orchestration to achieve certain objectives, and an all-of-government approach in terms of the things that they are trying to achieve in lifting up their citizens. And I think we need more of that. And I really don't believe while in Europe or in some of the other areas, you may have the issues of net neutrality and who's funding the capex. There's still the issue we have here of basic access. So let's not go into overdrive on the issues of the OTT's need to build our network, even for basic government services, even for education and things that benefit citizens without necessarily driving a lot of value. Access to the world's knowledge, as I think Tom said. What are we doing to ensure all of our citizens are able to partake of that? And I think that responsibility and targeting that outcome is a responsibility of African regulators and governments.
In addition to that, I think one of the things that AE is also doing is helping to align a lot of these policies because, like I said, there's policy misalignment, building a proper framework, and also having consistent stakeholder meetings, particularly with the OTT, with the telcos, and so on, bringing everybody into one room for them to help to add value to whatever, harmonizing the framework, the policy framework within the continent to make it easier, both for the telcos, also for the OTT, and also for the investors. So that is something that will obviously continue.
Yeah, and Tom, what's your view on that sort of like open dialogues and kind of this whole regulation debate?
I mean, the way I think about it is that the real value here is in growing the digital economy, and that should be the guiding light for that. And the creator economy is a really important part of that, and it powers it. So in terms of regulations, be happy to see the encouragement of the most efficient technologies, as I referred to before. I think making it easy for telcos to deploy new capacity, be that in terms of like spectrum policies, spectrum sharing policies. Those sorts of things I think would be helpful to make sure that we can get access to as many users as quickly as possible. But again, I think it all has to go back to that guiding light of let's grow the digital economy and make sure that when people are watching those videos, that's causing money to flow back into the local economy, into the creators' pockets.
All right, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I think you can all agree that was a very interesting and a very good open debate between all the panelists. So please give them a round of applause and our thanks.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you to all panelists as well. They did really well in giving us a lot of information about how to improve business environment and make it more affordable, make it more favorable to reinforce digital infrastructure, but also the uptake of digital services in Africa, hopefully before 2063. So now we're moving on to our next speaker, who's going to be giving a keynote presentation about building a more connected and secure digital future. We're going to probably take some example from America, as our speaker is Jessica Rosenworcel, who's the chairwoman for the United States FCC. Please welcome Jessica on stage.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the South African government for having me here and the organizers of this year's Africa Tech Festival. It is not a hardship assignment to spend some time in Cape Town. Now, for 27 years, the Africa Tech Festival has united global tech and telecom leadership across the continent, and the United States is so pleased to be a part of this forum. We were here last year, we're here this year, and I hope we'll be here in the future. And we do this because we believe engagement and partnership with Africa matters. We believe we share a vision when it comes to technology. We want to build a digital future that works for everyone, built on the principles of digital solidarity. Now, that idea of digital solidarity is really key to our international cyberspace and digital policy strategy. That strategy provides a roadmap for how we view not only the cross-border challenges inherent in cyberspace, but also the opportunities of our interconnected future. Now, partnering with African countries reinforces this interconnectedness. Partnering with African countries contributes to our collective growth and defense. And partnering with African countries helps us all safeguard infrastructure and the communities and economies that depend on it. Now, partnerships also involve sharing best practices and new ideas. And in that spirit, I want to talk about some initiatives we are pursuing at the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, in the United States. They involve two goals I think will be familiar to everyone in this audience, and that's because I know we share them. The first is universal connectivity, and the second is network security. So let me start with universal connectivity. I believe no matter who you are or where you live, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. And that's why at the FCC, we've pursued what I call a 100% strategy to help bring broadband to 100% of the people in the United States. Now, to do this, we are nurturing a competitive marketplace to spur private sector investment and innovation. And as in the past, a lot of that investment relies on ground-based solutions. But it is becoming apparent to us that if we really, truly want to reach 100%, we're going to need to be open to some game-changing improvements in space-based communications, and then the integration of these services into terrestrial networks. The reason is pretty fundamental. We have entered a new space age where rocket launches, they're just no longer rare, and satellites are no longer just big, bulky objects destined for decades in our skies. Today's satellites support calling, video, data, images, geolocation, and more. We've got new models, new players, many of whom exist down the road here in South Africa, and we've got new technologies coming together to change how we think about space-based communications. So that's why, for the first time in history, as the regulator in the United States, we set up a Space Bureau, and we're using it to work through the issues presented by this new space age. And of course, recognizing that every communications industry we oversee is stronger when it has competition, our Space Bureau has worked really hard to invite new entrants and support transparency. But what's coming next? It's even bigger. Because in the not too distant future, we're going to incorporate space-based communication in our terrestrial networks, including in the mobile phone you probably have in your palm or pocket right now. This will make it possible for every one of us to have a backup connection in the skies if our ground-based systems fail in disaster. It will also make it possible for us to end mobile dead zones. And it will make it possible for us to expand connectivity to the hardest to reach places. At the FCC, we are the first regulators in the world to adopt a framework for combining these two services. It's what we call supplemental coverage from space. And my hope is that our framework can be a launching point for other countries to establish their own. Now, clearing the way for the combination of terrestrial and space-based communications is a meaningful step toward what I think of as the single network future. In the single network future, we're going to connect everyone everywhere. But to do it, we are never going to be able to limit ourselves to one technology. We're going to need it all. Fiber networks, licensed terrestrial systems, unlicensed new technologies, satellite broadband, all of it seamlessly interacting in a way that is invisible to the user. To be clear, this vision does not work without satellites. The way I see it, satellites may be in our skies, but they're actually the anchor tenants in our communications future. Now, as we move towards this single network future, we're going to see all kinds of new space technologies and opportunities that depend on communications. We're going to see in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. We can explore the production of medicines and semiconductors in zero gravity. Real-time images from satellites will support a more sophisticated understanding of food security, crisis management, and even asteroid mining. If you add a mix of geostationary and low Earth orbit satellites, you'll also have a more resilient and adaptive form of connectivity globally. So this is really exciting, and it's still in our early days, this integration of satellite and terrestrial systems. But to make this vision work for universal connectivity, we're not only going to have to be open to the opportunities, we have got to take on some of the vulnerabilities as well. And one of those vulnerabilities is orbital debris. At the FCC, we're working to mitigate orbital debris so that the global space economy can actually meet our grandest ambitions. To be clear, we can no longer afford to launch satellites into our skies without being thoughtful about sustainability in space. After all, the more abandoned junk we have in orbit, the more likely we're going to have collisions that can destroy satellite communications and drag down this new space economy. That's why at the FCC we've got new policies in place. It used to be that we let our satellites sit up in our skies for 25 years after their useful life. We have reduced that time to 5 years. That's big because it can reduce the risk of collisions that can cause space communications failures. But there's more. Last year, the FCC announced its first ever enforcement action against a company for its failure to comply with its own satellite deorbiting plan. So if you want to put this all a lot more simply, if we authorize you to send something up into our skies, you've got to have a plan to take it back down. All right, that's universal connectivity. Now let's talk about network security. We all know that the future will feature more broadband in more places, involving satellite, wireless, and so much more, and it's exciting. But the more that we connect people and things around us, the more vulnerabilities we have in those connections, and we're going to have to address that. So at the FCC, we have a strategy to deter, defend, and develop. We're deterring bad actors by removing untrusted equipment from our networks. We're defending our networks by keeping out this equipment going forward. And we're supporting the development of new and innovative ways of providing secure service, including open radio access networks. All right, so that's the big picture. But let me get into some of the FCC's efforts to really promote secure communications. Right now, the agency works with our national security counterparts to identify network equipment that we believe poses an unacceptable security risk. We publicize this equipment in a list for everyone to see and make clear that going forward, the government will not support wired or wireless networks that have this equipment. And we've even set aside funds to help our smallest wired and wireless carriers rip it out and replace it. So that's security on the network side. But now let's move over to the consumer side, because we're also working to improve consumer trust in new technologies, and that's just as important. Today, there are billions of Internet of Things devices like fitness trackers and security cameras. And these connected devices make our lives easier in so many ways. During the next decade, they will multiply. There are those out there who believe that we will see as many as 1 trillion of them. And with all this growth, we're going to need policies to help make sure these connections are trustworthy. Why? Well, just imagine a baby monitor. You want that to be safe. You want to know when you bring that device into your house to watch your newborn, that connection is secure, and you're not going to invite any malware or malicious activity into your home. So that's why at the FCC we're setting up the United States Cyber Trust Mark. It's the first ever cybersecurity labeling program we've developed supported by the government. And when this mark is displayed, it will mean that the device has been certified to meet cybersecurity standards. The Cyber Trust Mark will help consumers make informed choices about the security and privacy of Internet of Things devices they purchase and bring into their homes or businesses. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned that we expect 1 trillion Internet of Things devices in the next decade. It is a lot. And of course, that's not all in the United States. And it's why we're going to continue to engage with partners across the globe, working on similar efforts to the Cyber Trust Mark, so that we can build a united front against bad actors who would exploit vulnerabilities in so many connected devices. All right, the last security proposal I want to highlight is something the FCC is actually going to vote on in just a few days. Now, as this audience knows, submarine cables are the backbone of global communications networks. They're buried in the deep, dark depths of the ocean, so we don't have to think about them all that often, but they carry 95% of the world's international internet traffic, including financial transactions that add up to more than $1 trillion a day. So they're really important. And over the past 2 decades, dependence on submarine cables has grown, the technology has changed, but the security challenges presented by them has expanded. So I noticed that FCC oversight has stayed the same during those 2 decades, and that's not right. Next week, the agency will vote to undertake the first major comprehensive review of our submarine cable policies since 2001. And as we do this, we recognize this is a global challenge. Securing undersea cables requires global solutions. It needs the engagement of a multi-stakeholder community, a lot like the one that's here today. And that's why I'm gratified that at the September UN General Assembly, we helped develop the New York Principles. The New York Principles are designed to help ensure the interoperability, sustainability, and resiliency of undersea cable infrastructure. We've got 30 countries who are signatories to the New York Principles, and we certainly encourage others to join. The bottom line is that international collaboration is essential to mitigating cyber risks and developing smart policies to address network security. It's not something that any country can do on its own. So we are here in Africa today to work with you. The multi-stakeholder community here is a terrific place to advance our shared goals, like universal connectivity and network security, and of course, work to build digital solidarity. This is a moment in our digital world where we need large states, small states, developed and developing communities. We need civil society. We need academic communities and technical communities. We're going to need the private sector. All of us need to work together to build a digital future that works for everyone. And there is so much to do, but I look forward to what our collaborations here at the Africa Tech Festival will bring. I want to thank you again for having me here today. Thank you to South Africa for hosting, and thank you to everyone else who made today possible.